So here we are, RDNA, AMD's response to NVIDIA's RTX 50. Today we have the RX 9070 XT, which during its presentation a few days ago seemed quite interesting on paper. Let's see how it performs in practice with this Pure model from Sapphire. Let's go! Well, I'm glad to offer an AMD card test and inform you quickly. So, thanks to them for providing a test card. And just like with NVIDIA's cards, obviously no early review from them or directives on the test content of course. So, RDNA 4 is AMD's new consumer GPU architecture, and I think we can say that the launch did not go as planned. We were supposed to have a presentation of it during AMD's keynote at CES, which was cancelled at the last minute. The same goes for the launch. It seemed to be scheduled for the end of January, with advertisements that hadn't been cancelled. And we also saw that there were cards at some retailers since the end of January as well. Why did AMD delay its release at the last minute? Well, nothing official, but probably to better reposition themselves against the RTX 5090A, which may have caught them a bit off guard, with $50 reductions on the MSRP of the RTX 5070 and 5070 Ti. Oh, and even after seeing the RDNA 4 presentation a few days ago, it seems like there were some tweaks to the dubbing and sound when it talks about the price. Clearly, I think AMD hadn't planned to release these cards at the prices that were announced, $600 for the 910 XT and $550 for the 9070, but the main thing is that this is indeed the case in the end. By the way, speaking of the presentation from a few days ago, in terms of format, I also found it to be much more serious and better presented than for RDNA 3, and it seems to me also translates some internal changes. Here there were fewer approximations, and an attitude showing more confidence in their own products, graphs that seem to show the performance of the cards as they are, without exaggeration and without up to, no mixing of raw performance against performance with upscaling plus RAM generation, and it was quite pleasing. So I hope they continue on this path, especially since AMD has, I believe, a card to play here, given the painful launch of the RTX 50 series with its numerous problems and an almost non-existent stock, and also with a completely outrageous price inflation. In a generation that was already struggling to generate enthusiasm given the minimal generational gains, this leaves AMD with an opportunity to score points with gamers, and from everything we hear, the stock of cards would apparently be much more substantial than for the RTX 50, which would also be very good news, even if it remains to be verified at the time of sale on March 6th at 3 PM, since obviously the fear is to see a situation similar to the RTX 50, with prices soaring unreasonably, and we hope there will really be stock, because whether it's AMD or NVIDIA's previous generation cards, there's not much left on the market in terms of cards, mid to high end, and it's been worsening month by month since the end of 2024, which creates a strong demand in this segment, especially regarding European prices. We should find the RX 9070 around $630 and the 9070 XT around $690 at the cheapest if we do the euro-dollar conversion by adding the 20% VAT. It's important to specify that there is no XT model, MBA, so the reference models are AMD for this launch, and there will only be partner cards. For those who are less familiar with AMD cards, there are certain brands that don't exist on the NVIDIA side. For example, Sapphire, PowerColor, and XFX, which are exclusive Radeon partners and generally offer good equipment at a price very decent, except for exceptions, of course. There are always occasional mishaps for all brands. And for the AIBs, which produce NVIDIA, AMD, or Intel cards, we should also find Asus, Gigabyte, ASRock, and Acer among the brands that could be distributed here. Otherwise, regarding the architecture, the new features and all that, I've already talked quite a bit about it in my presentation video from a few days ago. So I won't repeat everything here, and I invite you to watch that video if you're interested. You can also check out the excellent test report for the 9070 XT and 9070 on the Intel hardware website and co, which allows you to see all of this in detail at your leisure, and I'll put the link in the video description. But well, in broad terms then, with no RDNA 3 on the previous generation, AMD had taken the risk of going with an architecture featuring a multi-type design, so, roughly speaking, we split the GPU chip into several pieces, and we had the GCD with everything related to compute, calculation units, and smaller MCDs around the GCD with the memory controllers and part of the cache. And we bring all of this together on a base, a fabric, so that all these chips communicate with each other. This multi-type approach allowed AMD to use different manufacturing processes and reduce production costs, because, well, manufacturing smaller chips allows for less waste, economies of scale, and so on. The problem with RDNA 3 is that, as we quickly realized, there was a certain lack of efficiency in the architecture, perhaps due to this particular approach, since we never really achieved the 50% energy efficiency gains announced by AMD compared to RDNA, and the gaming performance was generally a notch below what we expected given the chip specs. At least on the high-end cards, and one of the weaknesses of a chiplet approach on graphics cards is that to communicate between the different chips, there's an additional step, increasing latency and energy cost towards the cache and controllers, memory in short. Multi-chip has its advantages and disadvantages, but the fact that it worked so well right from the start for a gaming architecture was nonetheless a feat. But the issue was that AMD needed a much larger and more expensive chip to compete with, for example, the RTX 4080 and its chip, which is almost 30% smaller, and which also had much less impressive specs. And regarding RDNA, AMD apparently set aside its very high-end chip quite quickly. We heard it quite soon in the rumors. It was said to be a very complex and ambitious multi-chip. Maybe it wasn't optimized or would have been too expensive. But in any case, AMD decided to focus on the mid to high-end range, returning to a monolithic chip approach. In a single block, with the Navi 48, which interests us today, Navi 48 is manufactured using TSMC's N4P process. And even if AMD is not targeting the high end, it's far from being a small chip. We're looking at 357 meters for 53.9 billion transistors, whereas the Navi 31 of the 7900 XTX XT was on a mix of N5 for the GCD and TSMC's N6 for the MCD, with a chip size of 5.95 mil and 50.7 billion transistors. So AMD managed to fit a quite enormous number of transistors into a much smaller package, and compared to the GB203, which equips the RTX 5080 and 5070 Ti, which is on a custom N4 for NVIDIA, at TSMC as well, we have a chip of 378mm for 45.6 billion transistors. So Navi is a similarly sized chip but denser than the GB203. And as a result, if everything goes well in terms of performance, it means that AMD is catching up on its efficiency deficit compared to the previous generation. In terms of specs, we will compare it to the 7900 XTX. For the 9070 XT, we have 4096 cores compared to 6144 for the 7900 XTX, which is still 33% less. 128 AI cores and 64 RT cores compared to 96 and 96 for the 7900 XTX. Regarding GPU frequencies, I will again use the average frequencies observed in games and not the frequencies on paper, with an average of 30 high 98 MHz for the 9070 XT compared to 2611 for the 7900 XTX, which still makes for a nice average boost of over 18% in frequency for the newcomer. And for the memory subsystem, we find a 256-bit bus for the 9070 XT compared to a 384-bit bus for the 7900 XTX. In terms of VRAM, we have 16GB of GDDR6 at 20 Gbps compared to 24GB of GDDR6 at 20 Gbps, as well for the 7900 XTX. So yes, we have less VRAM and a 33% decrease in bandwidth. And in terms of level 3 cache, which AMD calls Infinity Cache, we have 96 MB for the XTX compared to 64 MB for the 9070 XT. And for power consumption, we have a TDP of 304W for the 9070 XT compared to 355W for the XTX. In terms of ray tracing, we are looking at a new generation of ray tracing accelerators, which, according to AMD, would allow for a doubling of performance for certain tasks in rendering with ray tracing. The same goes for the new generation AI cores. Here too, it's more about acceleration than tensors, or matrix cores, as found with NVIDIA or Intel, or even on AMD's Pro ranges. However, AMD still announces a doubling of performance in FP16 and FP8 compatibility, which should enable FSR4, upscaling to finally have a machine learning approach, which should improve the image quality of the FSR upscale, which really needed it. However, this might limit the compatibility of this new upscaling to RDNA only, which is still unfortunate at a time when DLSS4 upscale is compatible with all generations of RTX, even if its impact on performance varies depending on the generation of cards. So, we'll see if FSR4 eventually arrives on RDNA 3, even if it means having an impact on performance, a little more demanding. This could be a compromise that some might accept to achieve better image quality than FSR3. Regarding the encoder, AMD announces having reworked it to mainly improve its performance for streaming use at low bitrate in H.264. I haven't tested it myself, but I'm sure some content creators specializing in streaming will discuss it very soon. But if this weakness is corrected, it's a good point since AMD's encoder was okay at high bit rates for videos in very high quality, but for streaming with, consequently, a rather low bit rate, the GeForce or even the Arcturus cards were still well above, which made it difficult to recommend an AMD card for GPU streaming. So, in the end, regarding the specs, the 9070 XT is still a much less impressive card on paper than the 7900 XTX, apart from the average frequencies on the GPU. Well, obviously they are not at the same price either, and it's not the same market segment, but how we hear that the newcomer could compete with the 7900 XTX in terms of performance. This would show that we are dealing with a much more solid architecture. And to see how it goes, today's card is a RX 9700 XT from Sapphire, the Pure model, which is the brand's white range. So regarding the look, obviously the white color is something you either like or don't like. It's quite gamer oriented without being too extravagant. No visible cables on the edge, which is a good point, and there's also a fairly discreet RGB trim. And if your power cables go downward, unfortunately it partially hides this one. A metal backplate with a flow-through design, and good news here, there's no label on the backplate since Sapphire had the good idea to place the labels on the edge below the card. This means that you don't see them when they are inserted into the PCI Express slot. I hope more brands will do the same. For cooling, we have 3 10cm diameter fans and 1 9cm in the middle. The card is relatively long, 32cm in length, 12cm in width, and about 6cm thick for a triple slot design. It weighs over 1 kilogram on the scale. Physically speaking, it's not too bad. However, there are still a few small points to highlight. At the radiator at the end of the card, as we can see here, it slightly warps, which means that in terms of overall finish, it gives a slightly twisted appearance, which is a bit unfortunate. And we also have, I would say, some defects and some markings on the paint. I don't know if it will be visible on the camera here. So I haven't done anything special with my card. I just placed it on one of my PCs when I wasn't using it while doing other tests on other cards. And I already have some small markings here on the paint. So maybe this one isn't incredibly resistant, which would be a bit unfortunate. So if you buy the card, do be a little careful to avoid any marks. But well, aside from these two negative points, I have nothing to complain about regarding the cooling system. It's true that after 2 rather noisy cards, what a pleasure this is. The Sapphire card is very, very quiet. You can barely hear it under load. In terms of temperature, the GPU is at 55 degrees on the core, 79 for the hotspot. The RAM is a bit hot at 88 degrees, but nothing problematic. And the fans run at 1150 RPM under load. Not much to complain about. It's well cooled and sufficiently quiet. For the power connectors, we have the classic 2x8 pin. And for the video outputs, it's slightly different from what you find on many other brands, as we have 2 HDMI ports and 2 DisplayPort 2.1a, whereas on most cards it's 1 HDMI and 3 DisplayPort. We also have an overclocked model with 40 MHz more on the core and 60 on the VRAM, which will likely have an impact of around 2% compared to a reference spec model, as well as a slight increase in power consumption of about 10 watts. For the bundle, not much to say. We have a card support to attach to the case, and the card, personally, I prefer small supports like lipstick holders. There is also an ARGB cable to attach to the card's backplate to connect it to the motherboard. That's it for the Sapphire 9070 XT Pure. Note that AMD apparently provides different models to most testers, which I think is a good thing because it allows for a wide range of different cards to be tested right from the release. So feel free to check out different reviews to see the various models. We are using the same testing protocol as before, 5090. It's a game tested in 1080p and 1440p, 3440p, 1440, and 4K. We will focus here on the 4K results, but you can see all the results in an additional video with all the performance slides, which will be the first link in the video description. The ray tracing tests are done in 1440p and 4K only, and with upscaling in quality mode active, because otherwise it wouldn't run properly on most cards, unfortunately. And before going further, we'll take a quick look at the performance for the FSR 4, and see if this one is more resource intensive than the 3 and a quick overview in terms of image quality. I'll probably do a more detailed comparison when I have a bit more time. Right now it's quite a rush, so let's go check it out. So regarding the impact on performance, I did some tests with the FSR 4 to see if it was heavier than the FSR 3, and indeed that seems to be the case, which might explain why this one would be reserved for the RX 9000. But maybe AMD will manage to optimize it in the future. But we see here, apart from Horizon Forbidden West, where the impact was really within the margin of error, for the other games, the FSR 4 is lighter by about 4 to 5%. So it's, I would say, at a cost quite similar to what we've recently observed with the transition from DLSS 3 to DLSS 4, upscaling on recent architectures. So it's still interesting to note, and we're going to take a first look at the image quality with 1440p FSR 4 quality against FSR 4 under the same conditions. Alright, so we start our little comparison. FSR 4 against FSR 4. We have FSR 4 in quality mode on the left, FSR 4 quality mode on the right. So already what we can note right away is at the level of the distant bridge here. We see that with FSR 4 it flickers a lot. That was one of the problems with FSR in general. It's that in terms of lighting and all that, at a distance, it's not always great. Here, the FSR4 overall is already much more stable. So next, we take a little trip through the city. Alright, here I slowed down the speed, but there are things you can also observe at normal speed. It's just that here it makes them stand out a little better. For those who aren't used to it, and it allows, I would say, to zoom in and all this to see a little better what's happening. Well, already in terms of lighting, we can see that it's much more detailed with the FSR4 than it was with the FSR4. And what you also need, well, to pay attention, for example, on the tower to the right, in motion, you would see it flickers a little there, but it does it much less now. What we can also see is on the sides of the buildings, on the buildings themselves. If you pay attention with the FSR4, when we are in motion, you can see that it flickers. At the level of the windows, for example, with the lighting, it blinks. Where the FSR4 is on the right, we will switch to normal speed, and you will see that it is much more stable overall. There is much less, the image is just sharper. There are fewer issues with that little flickering, which was quite constant with the FSR4 in general. And the image I find holds up much better now with the FSR4, so it's still a clear improvement. It's a result that is much closer to what was offered the DLSS 3 or the XDS compared to the basic FSR3. So another point that was a bit problematic with the FSR3 in general is the ghosting around the character, the disocclusion. Well, there is still some with the FSR4, but it's much less pronounced. Now, I'm going to have to zoom in because otherwise with the compression of the platform I think it will go unnoticed, but here I can already see it very well. It's not necessarily something you will pay attention to very closely, but once again, when we've seen this type of artifact, we tend to notice them better afterwards. Here, for example, you can see on the left, you see that when it moves, there's a small trail behind the character. And that is quite characteristic of FSR 3.1, which was much grainier at that level, and had more pronounced ghosting than even the basic FSR 2. And with FSR 4, we can see that there is still this tendency to have a small trail behind, but it is a little less pronounced, I find. If you pay attention, you can see it, but the contrast is a little less significant. So, well, it goes over better, even if it's still there. So there's still work to be done at that level, but overall it's already much better than FSR 3 in that regard. Now, another game where the implementation of FSR was really catastrophic is Surim Nantes 2. If you've already played the title, you might know what I'm talking about if you have a Radeon. So, well, here I've paused, we're in motion, but even here, just what we see right away is already a lot. Much sharper on the right compared to the left, especially on distant objects. If we zoom in a little or a lot, we can see that it's still much better defined on the right than on the left. And regarding the character, it's somewhat the same. We can see that in terms of the stance and the armor and all that. It's overall much cleaner. However, we'll see there is still a little bit of disocclusion around the character. Unfortunately, this is still present as we saw with Spider-Man. But there are still several points that are quite noticeably better with FSR 4. Already there in terms of the distant fencing, we can see that it shimmers much less now with FSR 4 than with FSR 4. Even though, depending on the distances, it can vary a little bit. But there are also the windows up here. If we go back a little bit, it might allow us to see a bit better. There, however, in terms of the glass, it's not much better than FSR 4. So, well, maybe something to correct. But there will be another segment later where it will be very apparent. Well, already here we can see that this little thing flickers, whereas on the right the barriers there hold up much better as well. But it's true that I don't know if you can see it in the video, but the image on the right is much, much sharper than with the FSR 4 on the left. And yet we are in quality mode for both. And here, a little bit like in Spider-Man, it's a bit on the sides of the buildings. Here, you can see that the FSR 4 shimmers like crazy. It's really awful. Whereas on the right, it holds up much better than the FSR 4. Here, well, it does nothing. It's absolutely insane. With FSR 3, it's absolutely hideous. So here, it's not perfect yet. Because it's still quite a complicated thing for upscalers. But it holds up much better. Already here, like this, it's much cleaner. With FSR 3, here on the left, you can see that in terms of the bricks and all that, it's not great. With FSR 4, it's not much better. I already saw it here when I was taking the screenshots. You can see that it's still going to go a little haywire, but overall still, I find that the image quality is much, much, much better with FSR 4 than with FSR 3, especially in this particular game. It's really very, very apparent. So, for Horizon Forbidden West, here again, I paused, but it already allows us to observe a little how things are going with the character. Well, there's a slight difference in lighting, but I still want to say that already, in terms of the character itself, in terms of what's happening, in terms of sharpness, it's better for FSR4 here as well. And already here, with FSR3, we can see that there are artifacts, since the camera is going to turn, where FSR4 still performs much better. We find a bit of the same artifacts as with Spider-Man. Here we see all around Haloi herself, in terms of her weapons and everything. It breaks down a lot. And there's another thing that's quite noticeable too, it's in the hair. It's much sharper with FSR4 than with FSR3. And we lose a little bit. This pixelated effect, a bit of a grid pattern that we had with FSR3. With FSR4 overall, it's much cleaner. You can see here what it looks like with the hair in motion. We see that on the left, it's much more pixelated and unstable than on the right. I know the distance isn't always the same and all that, but I think it's still quite noticeable. FSR4 performs much better overall. There is still quite a significant gap in image quality. And on Ratchet and Clank, well, here too, we see quite marked differences. For example, here with the rotating light sign, we see that on the left it's much more pixelated than on the right. This had always been a problem with FSA3. Transparency effects, those kinds of things, it struggled to handle. You can see it's very, very pixelated, whereas on the right it holds up much better. Regarding Ratchet himself, well, there we go. We see that overall it's still a little more defined in terms of details as well. The reconstruction is simply better. Overall, it's much cleaner. And here too, a bit like on Spider-Man, we see that when we move the camera, if we look at the statue here in the distance, we see that with FSR4, it still twinkles quite a bit. And even in terms of the scenery in the background with the distant buildings, there's still this effect, a bit of rather annoying shimmering. With FSR4 on the right, it's not perfect, but it holds up much better overall. We see that the statue, for example, has far fewer issues. So yeah, overall, I would say for an initial assessment of FSR4, comparing it only to FSR4, we already gain a lot in terms of quality. Images, where before the FSR4 in 1440p quality, it was still a bit borderline. Well, after it depended on the games, there were some that did a little better than others, but we always found a little bit the same flaws. And a good portion of these are corrected with FSR4. There are still, I would say, always these small issues of disocclusion around the characters. Well, sometimes also with DLSS or XDSS we encounter them. But what's encouraging here is that it's already much less pronounced than before. So that's pleasing. So, well, for a first look, I'm quite happy. And I hope AMD will continue to improve its algorithm. And now, I think it's possible to do it, whereas before they might have been a little more stuck. Now that they've taken this DLL approach, there might be a way, even through drivers, to upgrade to the new version of FSR4 when they've improved their algorithm, for example. So, there you go, pretty cool. We move on to the results on Blender Open Data. Note that the benchmark tool does not yet take into account the new AMD cards, but we were provided with a beta version to test the card on version 4.4, which, as a result, could also impact other cards that are still on version 4.3. However, generally the impact is not significant between different versions of Blender. And here it already allows us to see more or less where the 9070 XT roughly stands, but it should still be taken with a grain of salt, I would say, in terms of the overall ranking compared to other cards. But we see that here it is positioned just above the 7900 XTX, which is not too bad for a much smaller chip. However, there is still a quite noticeable performance deficit on Blender compared to Nvidia cards, as the 5070 XTX maintains an advantage of more than 72%, which is quite significant. For Procyon and image generation, artificial intelligence, here on the classic benchmark, we see that the 927 XTX improves by 25% compared to the 7900 XTX on Stable Diffusion 1.5, which is quite a nice gain. But we still remain almost 45% behind the 5070 Ti, so clearly, for this type of task, the RTX cards still have a clear advantage, and we can see that the 5090 outperforms all the other cards. Here, and for Stable Diffusion XL, we have a 21% gain compared to the 7900 XTX, which is also quite a nice gain, but we see that the 9070 XT is head-to-head with the RTX 4070, so here too, it's true that the GeForce cards still have a clear advantage, with a 61% lead for the 5070 Ti, so there's a gap, even larger than on Stable Diffusion 1.5. Nevertheless, I would say that for casual use in image generation, it will do the job. And we continue with gaming, starting as always with Alan Mac 2. The 970 XT performs quite well here, as it ranks just above the 7900 XTX with a consistently appreciable gain in 1% stability, and we find ourselves above the 7070 Ti here With ray tracing on low detail, which is the only mode without path tracing in the game, we see that just like the XTX, the 9070 XT performs well with this type of ray tracing light. As here too, it ranks above the 5070 Ti. On the other hand, once path tracing is activated, we see that the 5070 Ti takes the lead and the 9070 falls here between the 5070 and the 4070 Ti Super, which is still a quite respectable result. We see a 25% improvement compared to the 7900 XTX, which is a significant generational increase in terms of ray tracing and path tracing. It won't make the game super playable since we're below 60 FPS for most cards with upscaling, but still, the gain is still commendable. We move on to Blackmate Wukong and find the 5070 Ti 7900 XTX and the 9070 XT neck and neck with a slight advantage in the 1% for AMD's new card. So, rather good result. We're not that far from the 5080. However, with ray tracing, it's a different story and it remains very, very complicated for AMD's cards here, since the 9070 XT is positioned between the RTX 3080 and the 3090 Ti. But we're almost at double compared to the 7900 XTX nonetheless, which is still a very nice improvement here. But well, it's mega heavy and it still doesn't allow AMD's cards to perform well here, but it's a clear improvement nonetheless. But it's true that the 5070 Ti also nearly doubles compared to the 9070 Ti. In this scenario, we immediately see that depending on the games, ray tracing can still be an issue for the Radeons. A more classic game now, Call of Duty Black Ops 6, which often favors the Radeons, and we see that here the 9070 Ti positions itself between the 5070 Ti and the 7900X, being closer to the latter, and it's a good score here for AMD's new card. On Cyberpunk 2077, we see the 9700 XT with a performance level similar to the 7960X, 5070 Ti and 4080 Super, but with more stable 1% lows here again, so it's not bad at all. And with Ultra Ray Tracing, it's also a significant improvement compared to the 7960X, as now the 9070 XT positions itself against the 4070 Ti Super, so a notch behind the 5070 Ti but ahead of the RTX 5070. In path tracing, however, it's more complicated, and the 9070 XT now positions itself against the RTX 5070 and 4070, and the gain compared to the 7900 XTX is less pronounced than in other games with path tracing. As we've seen from the beginning, basic ray tracing, it's going much better for the 9070 XT compared to previous generations. However, in games with path tracing, it remains difficult and a bit random. It will depend on the games, even though, well, we remain in clear progress compared to RDNA 3. For Dragon Age the Vanguard, well, it's a game where the RTX 50 performs very well, and here, the 9070 XT still manages to match the performance level of the 7900 XT and 4080 Super, so nothing is going wrong, but the 7070 Ti does better in this game. In ray tracing, here, well, it's not going too badly. It's not the most intensive ray tracing. The 9070 XT reaches the level of the 5070 here, which is very decent, with 17% better performance than the 7900 XT, but the 5070 Ti is almost 28% above here. For Final Fantasy XIV now, a poor performance here for the 9070 XT, which ends up at the level of the 5070 and behind the 7900 XT. Lack of roll driver optimization, I presume on DirectX 11 games. I haven't delved deeply into the subject since it's the only DirectX 11 title in the panel. We'll see when I test on a broader range of games, but it's clearly an exception here. For Final Fantasy XVI's, back to normal with the 9510 XT just behind the 7900 XTX and above the 4080 Super and 5070 XTX on the title, which remains very demanding nonetheless. Flight Simulator 2024. It's a nice score too, as the 9070 XT positions itself at the level of the 5080. Just like the 7900 XTX did, but the newcomer shows good stability here again at the 1% level. Ghost of Tsushima, a game generally favorable to AMD cards, performs very well here for the 9070 XT, which is once again at the same level as the 5080, but a little behind the 7900 XTX. So it's still a very good score, there's nothing to say, as it leads the 5070 Ti by 11% in this game. For God of War Ragnarok, however, we find a range of cards with similar performance levels. Well, the classics 5070 Ti 4080, Super 9070 XT and 7960X at the same overall performance level. For Horizon Forbidden West, as often, the 9070 XT positions itself at a similar performance level to the 4080, 7960X, with a slight advantage for the 5070 Ti here. For Indiana Jones, however, it's more in favor of Nvidia, as the new AMD card barely matches the 5070 and is a notch behind the 7960X, so not its best title, but still a very respectable performance on a game with mandatory ray tracing. And here, there is no upscaling activated. The 5070 still leads by 26% on this game. For Marvel Rivals, the 9070 XT ends up just slightly behind the 7900 XTX, but it's very, very close. But it's true that there's a 16% advantage for the 5070 XTX on this game. On Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, the 9070 XT is ahead of the 7900 XTX, and the 5070 XT is a few FPS above. No major difference, and with ray tracing, this is a title where AMD cards generally perform quite well, and that's still the case here as the 9070 XT comes in here. Roughly speaking, at the same level as the 4070 Ti Super, the 5070 Ti leads by 15%. However, it's quite playable for AMD's new card here, which shows a 12% improvement compared to the 7900 XTX. For its current lens then, as often, the 9070 XT finishes just slightly behind the 7900 XTX, and it's a game where the GeForce generally perform better, particularly for the RTX 50, since the 5070 Ti comes in 24% above here. And of course, if we activate ray tracing, we find the 9070 XT facing the 4070 Ti Super, as has happened several times already, so it's not bad at all, and it's an improvement by about 8% compared to the 7900 XTX. However, the 5070 Ti remains 18% above. And finally, we have Star Wars Outlaws, and the 9070 XT performs very well, indeed on par. With the 7900 XTX, we are just slightly behind the 5070 Ti, and so the overall gaming experience is similar. However, with ray tracing, it's more challenging, and we drop a notch to find the 9070 XT facing the 4110 Super and the 3090 Ti. Well, it's not really playable no matter what. A 12% improvement compared to the 7910 XT, and the 5070 Ti ends up with nearly a 30% advantage. So once again, intensive ray tracing remains challenging for AMD cards. Let's move on to the averages, starting with 1080p. And clearly AMD's new card performs very well, as it matches the performance of the 5070 Ti and 7900 XTX, and often offers better frame rate stability at 1080p, which is well reflected in the average here. So, rather good performance here for the newcomer, even though, as often is the case for 1080p, such a powerful card isn't necessary to play properly, but it ranks among the top in 1440p raster. Then, we still find this slight gain in stability for the 9070 XT on the 1%. And even though on average we are very slightly behind the 7960X and 4080 Super, it's practically the same level of gameplay in most situations, and it clearly competes directly with the 5070 Ti in terms of performance. The 9070 XT still outperforms the 5070 released yesterday by nearly 25% on this test panel. So it's significant for a card that's quite similar in price. We find a 37% improvement over the 7900 GRE, which aligns quite well with what AMD announced in their presentation, and we are roughly 50% above cards like RTX 3080 or 6800 XT, which might start to intrigue some owners of such cards, since the 9070 XT should be at a similar price level, as those cards were at their release in 2020, and compared to cards like the RTX 3070, 6700 XT or 2080 Ti, we are looking at about 2x, just as was the case for the 5070 Ti, so here too the grade becomes much more interesting. And if you are still using a venerable GTX 1080 Ti, we are looking at over 200% improvement with the 9070 XT, which starts to make a significant difference even in 1440p. Moving on to ray tracing, an area AMD was under scrutiny. The 9270 XT performs well in 1440p upscale between the 4070 Ti Super and the 5070 Ti. It's usable. AMD makes strides, improving by nearly 15% over the 7900 XTX and 56% better than the 7900 GRE, which was the card more or less at this price level in the previous generation. For ray tracing, however, well, as we saw in the slides in 4K, it remains very challenging for AMD cards in general, but the 9270 XT manages in 1440p upscale as it positions itself between the 4070 and the 3090 Ti. This is an improvement of 34% compared to the 7900 XTX and more than 80% compared to the 7900 GRE, but the 5070 XTX still remains more than 40% above the 9070 XT for this type of task in raster at 3440 by 1440, while the 9070 XTX maintains the same overall level as the 7900 XTX, 5070 XTX, and 4080 Super. So it's very good, and it also retains this slight advantage on its 1%, so rather good performance for the 9070 XTX, which will do the job very well at this resolution. In 4K raster, the 9070 XT loses a little ground versus 1440p against the 5070 Ti, 4080 Super, and 7200 XTX. We still remain at the same level of play. We're around a 5% difference. Nothing major here. Still at 25% better than the 5070, 39% compared to the 7900 GRE, and 54% against the 3080, and almost double the performance of the 2080 Ti or 3070 XTX, which would be, roughly speaking, at the same level, or even slightly worse than the AC with 8GB of VRAM. So, depending on your current card, it could be a nice upgrade, just like in 1440T. However, obviously, if you already have a card like the 4070 Ti 7900 XT or higher, the new AMD card won't offer you much more. So for native 4K, some it holds up quite well, even though obviously compared to the 4090 or the 5090, it's far behind, but of course we're not at the same price level either. So it's hard to complain too much here. For ray tracing in 4K, with upscaling quality, the 9070 XT still holds up quite well on light ray tracing, if we can say that, as it reaches the level of the 4070 Ti Super, which is quite respectable. However, for path tracing, it remains complicated. Everything below the 4070 Ti Super falls under an average of 30 FPS, so, well, 4K. Path tracing remains unattainable for most graphics cards except for the 4090 and 5090, and even for those cards it doesn't come without compromises. Moving on to energy efficiency with performance per watt, and in 1440p, we see that AMD is also making progress here compared to RDNA, with almost 22% better than the 7900 XTX here, and in 4K it's not bad at all, 15% more efficient than the 7900 XTX. We're almost at the same level of efficiency as the 5070 and 4070 Ti Super or 4070, so AMD still hasn't caught up with Nvidia at this level, but we're not that far behind anymore. So it's quite good to see AMD improving in this area. 33 watts difference between the 970 XT and the 5070 T. Well, it's not a huge deal either. For overclocking now, well, for AMD cards, we stick to the same approach as the previous generation. We first look for the maximum that the VRAM can handle, which was 2800 MHz here. Then, we increase the power limit to the maximum as well as the GPU frequency slider, which will find its own limit. After that, we lower the GPU voltage until we find the point where it crashes. For me, it was minus 90 MV. This allowed for a 7% performance gain by increasing the power consumption by 28W, knowing that it's also a factory overclocked model. So regarding my test card, it has overclocking potential, pretty decent, and quite comparable to that of the two RTX 5070 Ti cards I was able to test. So to conclude this RX 9270 XT, I'm quite happy overall. For this card, even though everything isn't perfect, nothing ever is, of course. But already, the fact that AMD managed to achieve performance almost equivalent to the 7900X in raster and superior in ray tracing, with a much smaller chip on a manufacturing process that isn't incredibly better, well, that's still pleasing, since Navi 31 is still 48% larger than Navi Grand 8. It's funny, by the way. It's funny, it would be nonsense. Even Total Space, it's funny, it makes me laugh. And I find that RDNA 4 as a whole is a much better architecture than RDNA 3. It's more balanced, better energy efficiency, even though the 9070 should be even better in that regard, I suppose. But it's true that it doesn't leave me with that feeling of it should have been better that the 7900XX left me with, which did disappoint me. So certainly, if we compare it to the RTX 5080 and its GB203, Nvidia maintains the overall performance advantage with a similar size, but the 5080 also carries a much wider bandwidth, almost 50% more thanks to the GDDR7. So, if AMD had also gone with GDDR7 in terms of raster performance, I think it could have been a match. On the other hand, in terms of ray tracing, it's clearly a significant improvement compared to the previous generation, and for normal or light ray tracing, let's say, the 9070 XT often positions itself against the 4070 XT Super, which is quite nice and perfectly usable with the help of upscaling, of course. And regarding games with path tracing, which are often an Nvidia implementation, it must be noted it's more complicated for the 9070 XT in this type of scenario, and it drops to a performance level similar to the RTX 4070. However, it still represents a significant improvement compared to the 7900 XTX, which is a very good thing. It's good to see that AMD is progressing, and the fact that Nvidia has rather stagnated in terms of ray tracing on the RTX 50 with current games narrows the gap between the two brands, even though Nvidia still maintains the lead in this area. So then, the question we can ask ourselves once we've said that obviously is in which direction will future games head? Will there be more games like Indiana Jones or the next Doom with mandatory ray tracing, or will raster or hybrid raster with ray tracing continue to be predominant in the coming years? Well, as I regularly say, as long as the new generations of consoles are not here and we are still in, I would say, the mandatory cross-gen period, I don't think we'll see a major paradigm shift in what is already happening currently. So yes, we will have path tracing versions and the like on PC, from time to time a little bit like currently, but I can hardly imagine that it will be on the majority of games, but rather a few very specific titles, as is the case currently. Because, well, it's true that in the end, the number of games with path tracing, there are still not even 10. And given the hardware needed to run them properly, well, I don't think the shift will happen tomorrow. It will take time, and over the lifespan of a more or less standard setup, the 9070 XT should do the job for the next 5 to 6 years without too many problems. So, regarding ray tracing and especially path tracing, I would say it's up to you to decide if you place great importance on it, and if you want to have the best possible performance in the future, and if that's the case, it would be better to aim for a GeForce. Also for image quality, since ray reconstruction is quite important for path tracing, and for now, AMD doesn't have an equivalent. Otherwise, regarding FSR4, which was highly anticipated here, as we saw earlier in the video, in terms of performance, FSR3 is roughly 4% lighter, but it's a bit like with DLSS 4. In the vast majority of situations, the gain in image quality is so significant that it's worth losing a few percent of performance here. And in terms of image quality, precisely for today's video, it was a first look. We'll need to see the comparison with DLSS 3 and DLSS 4 as well, but overall it's still very promising for a first draft. The most striking example for me was on Remnant 2 and Spider-Man as well, where Phasar 3 was really very unstable on the buildings, with a lot of shaking in the image, the neon lights and all that. Phasar 3 doesn't like that much. The ghosting around the characters, and this mosaic effect that we find with Phasar 3, well, isn't it also broader, and overall, the image is still much sharper, even in 1440p than quality, which finally becomes really usable for the Radeons, whereas before it was often very messy, so the FSR4 overall performs much better than the 3. Everything is not perfect, but it is still a much better foundation for developing new versions than FSR 2 and 3 were. And I hope that this time AMD will ensure to improve its algorithm more often than they did during the time of FSR 2, which hadn't really evolved between FSR 2.2 and FSR 3.1. But at least I would say it reduces the gap in image quality between DLSS or even XeSS, even if the trade-off is probably the exclusivity of FSR4 for RDNA and future architectures. And AMD also needs to be able to expand the support for its technology even faster, since NVIDIA maintains broader compatibility for DLSS 4 from the start. But we'll see if modes allow replacing DLSS with FSR4, for example, or things like that. We've already seen this in the past, so I haven't had the time yet to take a look at FMF 2.1 or the encoder, nor the few new features at the driver level, apart from the activation of FSR4 regarding adrenaline in general. So, I still think that AMD should review the ergonomics a bit, because for someone who has never used the program, it has become quite cluttered, since AMD has added many features and options over time, which is a very good thing, but it makes navigation quite cumbersome. Finding certain options is not always very logical, so I know for those who are used to it, they will say, "But it's easy." Well, yes, if you've been using it all the time for years, of course you know where you need to go. But put yourself in the shoes of someone coming from NVIDIA driver or NVIDIA and who is not very comfortable with this kind of tool. I can assure you they will quickly get lost. Regarding professional performance, it's up to you, depending on the programs you use. And I encourage you to look at tests that delve deeper into these topics. But generally speaking, it's true that NVIDIA often still holds an advantage in applications. And if you need or want the NVIDIA ecosystem, then in that case, it can also justify a more expensive card. As always, it all depends on what you do with your equipment. The 5070 is a more complete card overall, but it's also much more expensive, especially right now, and depending on your demanding criteria, whether you prefer it as a gamer or for work. Meanwhile, it might remain more relevant for your use to stick with the greens unless it's about the frame. So, I based it on the recommended prices, and I know that the prices are not really applied, especially for the 50 series currently. But as if I would say that it's impossible to set an average price on these cards, here, we will rely on the official prices of the different cards, since it already seemed interesting to me to show how things are going, touched with this generation with the theoretical prices. And with some cards from the previous generation as well for comparison to see the evolution in terms of performance, price from one generation to another, even though for the previous generation cards their price had obviously dropped in 2024. And as we can see here, obviously the 5090 is the worst deal from a purely point of view. Price performance, even if its level of performance is entirely different from the other cards present here. But we see that even the RTX 4080, at its launch price of $1,300, was a better deal from a purely point of view, cost per frame than the 1590, and the 7900X was also much better positioned than the 4080 initially, but that advantage had more or less disappeared with the arrival of the 4080 Super, and the 5080 at its base price is more or less at the same level of performance. Price, partly due to the current drop in the euro exchange rate, which raises its price above the launch price of the 4080 Super, which is somewhat of a double punishment for us in Europe. And as we can see here, clearly the 5070 Ti, which is my favorite in the RTX 50 range, is still much better positioned than the 5080, given the performance difference, not so huge for, in theory, $300 less. The RTX 5070, which was released yesterday from a strictly free performance point of view, is better positioned than the 5070 Ti, but only by 5%. But that, I would go, this is not taking into account the loss of 4 GB of RAM in the process, so in terms of the complete package, well here too, the 5070 Ti is still more balanced. And for me, it shows that the 5070 should be cheaper than that. Otherwise, for RDNA, we clearly see that at its base price, the 9070 XT is still much better positioned, even compared to the 5070, with 15% better in terms of cost per frame, making it the best deal of this new generation. So far, since it still has 25% better raw performance, ALP, for not even 50 euro more, at least if the prices are respected for the release of these two cards, which are not yet on sale at the time I'm preparing this video. And it's still one of the concerns I have regarding the launch of the 9070 XT. On paper, it's a good deal, and one of the best cards from a performance price perspective for quite a long time. But will it be available in sufficient quantities at its base price? That's still quite uncertain at this point. We've heard that there would still be much more stock of the 9070 XT by itself, more than all the stocks of RTX 50, including 5070 at some retailers. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the stock of 9070 XT will be massive or sufficient, and that the prices won't be likely to be inflated. Them too. There is clearly some hype around the card, and rightly so. The price is attractive for the performance offered, and it will inevitably draw people in, especially during this shortage period, I would say, for cards of this caliber. And clearly, if, after seeing the test, the 9070 XT interests you, I think you shouldn't delay when it goes on sale, especially for the cheaper models. So, make arrangements for the sale tomorrow at 3 PM and I hope there won't be too much abuse from the shops or some AIBs. AMD's historical partners are often quite fair, but that doesn't mean that during this kind of period, it couldn't change. There's money to be made. So, in short, the RX 9060 XT for me is a good card, a very fair price, especially in the current period, and it makes me happy to see AMD coming back with a good product here. And I hope the launch goes well. And if you manage to snag a card at the recommended price, I think you won't be disappointed. The model tested today was also very good, and I think the Sapphire Pulse model is most likely overall the same thing, but it will surely be a little cheaper, so if it's available at MSRP, it could be an interesting card as well. As for the RX 9070, well, I don't have a test sample, but I invite you to check out Eric's review on the website, Hardware & Co., which also does excellent work. But from what I've seen of the 9070 in AMD's documents, well, once again, it's a little bit the trick of the ugly girlfriend strategy, ugly, as they had already done with the 7900 XT and 7700 XT in the previous generation, with a 9070 that makes you more inclined to go for the 9070 XT, which is still more appealing, despite a higher price, simply because the price-performance ratio is better for the 9070 XT. Why does AMD regularly pull this trick on us? Well, I don't know. Either it's to sell more XTs, or it's because, practically speaking, they cannot or do not want to sell Navi 48 cheaper than this, because here, between the two cards, there isn't really a significant difference apart from one disabled compute unit. We have 16GB of VRAM on both. In production, it must cost almost the same, but it's true that at $500 it would have been a very, very good card. At $550, it's still more complicated with the XT being so close in terms of price, and it also makes it a bit less competitive against the RTX 5070, since we end up with a configuration similar to what we had in the previous generation, with the 9070 having better raster performance and more VRAM and less retracing performance than the 5070 here, at the same price. And from experience with sales on previous generations, it wasn't a winning configuration for AMD in those scenarios, so we'll see if it happens the same way here or over time. But it's true that, as I also saw in the comments, several of you mentioned that, given its 220W consumption, the 9070 was potentially interesting for those with small power supplies looking to upgrade, which is a completely valid argument. But also don't forget that even if the XT consumes significantly more, unless you have a processor that consumes a lot, a good quality 650W of power supply will do the job for the 9070 XT without too many problems. If you pair it with a Ryzen 5 or 7, I don't really see the issue, and it's true that I'm also quite curious to see the other variations of RDNA 4 with the upcoming 60 series, which should arrive in some time, and we hope it will shake things up a bit, things also in the entry-level segment. So in short, I think we've covered everything for today. As usual, if you enjoyed the video, the things paid by YouTube, it's silly but it helps, the channel's Amazon page for examples of typical conflicts and the current graphics cards, and we hope some will arrive. It's in the video description. Also, a big regulatory kiss for the supporting members of the channel's Ko-fi and YouTube page for your support and for your contribution to its survival. It makes us really happy, and we'll see you very soon for more videos. Sending you kisses. See you next time. Bye.